This is Calvin Castine. It's July 20th, 2002, and we're outside the famous Hollywood restaurant on the western edge of the town of Ellenburg. And this is the Narrows area of between the lower and upper Chateaugay Lakes. And we are here because it's a gathering point, a stopping point for the 4th annual Chateaugay Lakes Art Association Heritage Day. And today's theme is boats, hotels, and the lakes. If you've been with us in the past, we covered the 3 previous events, all held in Lion Mountain, highlighting the mines, and then the railroads, and last year baseball and music. And our emphasis, of course, was on baseball. We're hoping to bring you a small variety of what happened today, so stick with us. This should be an interesting program. And I should point out that although Ves Pavetta had mentioned it to me when I did the Lion Mountain Parade, I asked him what date it was. He said the 20th. There was nothing in the paper until today, and the article probably would have been one that I might have skipped over had I not talked yesterday to Ted Mills at the House of History in Malone, and he reminded me this was going on and gave me some details, because although we've covered it every year, the Chateaugay Lakes Art Association never deems it appropriate to contact Hometown Cable to fill us in on what's happening. So we don't find out about this till the last moment. So if there's somebody out there from the Chateaugay Lakes Art Association viewing this tape, how about letting Hometown Cable in on the secret and letting us know what's happening before the day of the event. Let's move on. And through the magic of television, we are magically instantly transported, I should say, to the Banner House up the road, just a few kilometers from Hollywood. We're now in Franklin County, however. And we're here for a lecture, and we'll fill you in on that. Pretty nice view. The Banner House is a bed and breakfast with a spectacular view of the lower lake. There are 2 lecturers this year. This is the one that we're covering at this point. Whether we get to the other one or not, only time will tell. This is Reverend Henry Rushmeier. He's the author of Chateaugay Lake, a case study in Adirondack resorts. And there are about 8 times more people here than there are chairs, so it's going to be quite a little crowd in this, I would guess, dining room here at the Banner House.
We need Jim and his whistle. I'm Linda Furness, and I'm introducing our guest speaker today. Okay. I'm Linda Furness, and I'm introducing our guest speaker today, the Reverend Henry Rushmeier, who made his first trip to Chateaugay Lake in July of 1945 with his mother, grandmother, and his sisters by train from New York. And we were met at the Lion Mountain Station by Marjorie Riley, and she brought us to the hotel, Maryland House at that time, with her car. And Hank has stayed at the lake intermittently since then, until he was ordained as an Episcopal clergyman in 1979. And since then, his visits have not been as frequent, though I know his heart is still here. He has received degrees from Union College in Schenectady, Bank Street College of Education in New York, General Seminary in New York, and New York University. Having served in parishes in Albany, Clifton Park, New York City, and London, he's presently an assistant priest at the Church of the Redeemer in Sarasota, Florida. For his college thesis in 1966, Hank wrote a history of the lakes entitled Chateaugay Lake, a case study in Adirondack resorts, covering the years 1840 to 1917. His lecture will be based on excerpts from this unpublished work. So now I introduce the Reverend Henry Cassell Rushmeier and my brother, Henry.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Linda. And just want to say at the beginning how wonderful it is to be back here at Chateaugay Lake. I think I was here 2 years ago, and then not 10 years that time. So it has been intermittent, but indeed, my love for the lake has never diminished. I have some slides which I'll present at the close of the lecture, and they're based on some photographs that I took when I was a child of the various buildings around the lake. But to get to the heart of the matter here this morning, and so nice to see so many of you on this beautiful, beautiful day in July. The lecture this morning is based upon, as Linda has described, the paper that I wrote when I was a student at Union College. So it spans the years 1840 to 1917. And the lecture is in 6 parts. The first part, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how I came to write this history. And then I'll give you a brief synopsis of the history. And then we'll start here with the lower lake, here at the Banner House, which is the oldest and only hotel still existing on the lake. And then the development of the upper lake, and then early camps on the lake, and finally the later camps up to 1917. After spending almost every summer or part of it at Chateaugay Lake, since I was 1.5 years old, with my parents and sisters, as well as grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, centered around the Merrill House on the upper lake, and later the Bishop's Camp, now Dutton's, on the Shore Road, and even later at Cragsmere, the original Hayes Camp on Pine Point, between Indian Point and Split Rock Point on the upper lake, those years being 1945 to 1975 for me. I, like probably everyone here today, developed a love for Chateaugay Lake, which continues to carry through in my life. How amazing it is that I still compare lakes I have seen elsewhere, even abroad, in England's Lake District, to this lake. The great Adirondack forest, the soil, the rocks, the animal life, all here at Chateaugay Lake are unique, I believe. Our lakes, with their sandy beaches, are treasures most other lakes do not have. Then there is the kind of Adirondack architecture in hotels and camps which have been models for rustic as well as gracious living elsewhere. As I travel about still, all beaches are measured by Merrill Beach. All woods and forests, and the forest floor by those I came to know as a child at Chateaugay Lake. The place truly has a magic about it, which is indescribable. Such magic, I am sure, has been the drawing card for everyone who has settled here from the early 1800s to the present day, whether year-round families or summer visitors such as myself. All of the many associations over the years through family and residence at Chateaugay Lake have provided me with a wealth of happy memories, as well as a yardstick for measuring what is really good in life and what is merely illusion or second rate. Here at Chateaugay Lake, we who know it have experienced an incomparable jewel among lakes and summer resorts, which brings us all back year after year, even in our dreams, when the actual trip is not possible. And so similarly have been touched the hundreds, probably thousands of people who, one way or another, have known this beautiful and special place. Recently, while visiting my mother one day at her nursing home in Sarasota, Florida, I was sitting with her and my father, along with other residents and their family members on the terrace, waiting to go inside for dinner. Somehow it seemed all very similar for me when years back we once waited in rocking chairs on the Merrill House porch, waiting for one of the waitresses to come outside and ring the handbell, announcing that dinner was ready to be served. On this particular occasion in Sarasota, my father, who first came to Chateaugay Lake in 1924 with his parents, 2 sisters and a brother, to stay at John Tobin's camp on the Narrows as his guests, which is now Camp Chateaugay, inquired out loud whether we should all go in for dinner. This was in Sarasota. Trying to make a light joke of the matter, I said I didn't hear the dinner bell ring yet. My father, one not given to light jokes, or quick to make arcane associations with the past, said, "I didn't know that they rang a bell for dinner here." "Just a joke, Dad," I said. "You know, like the bell they used to ring at the Merrill House." Apparently our conversation did not go unheard. One of the residents, James, sitting nearby, said, "I know the Merrill House." Cautiously, I explained that it was an old hotel no longer standing on Lake Chateaugay in the Adirondacks. To my amazement, James knew the lake. And so many place names around it, from being a camper at Camp Chateaugay on Split Rock Point for the season 1940 to 1941. "It was Mr. Shoemaker's camp," he said. Ever since then, I have been a supplier of information about the lake for James, who remembers such things as going to Lion Mountain for groceries, let alone the names of the Banner House, Brainardsville, and even Katyville. Like so many of us, James, as a young boy, has carried with him throughout his life wonderful memories of this enchanting place. You too, I am sure, in your travels have met people who know of this lake, perhaps through being a camper here years ago, like James, or a hotel guest, or a guest of a camp owner long since gone. Happily, I have continued to summer at Chateaugay Lake when growing up, and not just for a year or two. During the 1950s, so many private camps were closed, and so many stories circulated among the adults at the lake about the people who once lived in them and who summered here. Always liking history, I became intrigued early on about who these people were, and in some cases, like Alice Bentley, who was still alive when I was young, what these people once did in life. My opportunity came to write a history of Chateaugay Lake in 1966 when I was a senior at Union College, Schenectady, New York. A thesis was a requirement for graduation. I was a history major, and I chose to write on a subject dear to my heart, and probably one nobody else dreamed of doing, especially my professors. I had a year to do the research and write the paper. It turned out to be 166 typewritten pages, in addition to a bibliography of another 14 pages. All the footnotes, which contain some background history of the people mentioned in the text, are all at the bottom of the relevant pages in the actual thesis. I spent much time in libraries, especially in Schenectady, New York City, and Saranac Lake, and visited the lake on several occasions during that year to speak with Ralph Bellows on the Lower Lake and Marjorie Riley, then proprietor of the Merrill House on the Upper Lake. I also made a trip to Hyde Park, New York to see Charlotte Hackett, who first came to the lake as a guest of Uncle Dick Schutz's hotel on Indian Point, and later, with her husband John, owned simultaneously the Hayes and Smithwick camps on the west shore of the Upper Lake. Letters from various other people with lake connections also provided additional information. The history was well received by my professors at Union College, and since then, various local libraries have made copies of it, as well as some of you around the lake, all of which I was only too happy to comply with, meeting such gratifying requests in sharing it. Now I wish to tell you more about what's inside this history I wrote 36 years ago, when some of the people I wrote about were still alive, or at least alive in the memories of those people who were related to them. The history contains 10 chapters. The first 3 are about resorts in general, and the Adirondacks in particular during the 19th century onward. Names like Newport, Saratoga Springs, and Bar Harbor appear along with Saranac Lake, Lake Placid, and Lake George, to name a few Adirondack Lake resorts. Truly, grand hotels such as the Prospect House on Blue Mountain Lake once stood in some of these places, along with famous camps like Sagamore Camp, Sagamore Lodge on Racket Lake. Names of individuals like the hotelier Paul Smith of St. Regis Lake and the doctor Edward Livingston Trudeau of the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium in Saranac Lake are credited with helping to give impetus to the Adirondacks becoming a renowned summer resort. The remaining 7 chapters are mostly about us, or rather about our lake and the many people over the years who made it home. For a few weeks or months or all year long, and covering the years, as I've mentioned, 1840 to 1917. The story begins on the Lower Lake, here where we are gathered today, partly due to the first stagecoach and railroad link from Chateaugay in 1852. Earlier, the original families came mostly from Gilmartin, New Hampshire, who settled, including the Drews, Bellows, and Merrills, who settled on the Lower Lake, taking up farming and then turning to hunting and fishing, centered around the hotels which they established to accommodate hunting and fishing parties from the cities. The hotel keepers, like the Bellows and the Merrills, provided guides for their guests. It was originally a man's world, but soon the ladies wanted to be included. With them came more conveniences. The hotels provided more comfortable rooms and dining rooms with menus as the years went by. Jonathan Bellows' Chateaugay Lake House was Chateaugay Lake's first hotel, and today is the only one still standing, here where we are assembled today at the Banner House. The famous guests at the Bellows Hotel in these early years before the Civil War were Arthur Fitzwilliam Tate, once described as America's greatest sporting artist, and Chester Harding, a portrait painter. Early on, artists came to the lake. In later years, there would be a flowering of artistic people from the stage, opera, and dance. Tate's years at the Bellows Lake House were 1852 to 1855, just 3 years. During that time, he painted much in the local area, including 5 paintings that we know of, entitled, and maybe you know some of these yourself, Returned from Hunting, The Halt in the Woods, a scene near Chateaugay Lake, Franklin, New York, dated 1852, Winter Sports, Trout Fishing on Chateaugay, 1854, Sugaring Off, Forest Scene in Early Spring, 1854. The fourth one, A Second Shot, Still Hunting in the First Snow in the Chateaugay Forest, also 1854. And Arguing the Point, Settling the Presidency, 1856. Many of these paintings were painted in New York, but Tate did sketches here at the lake, and then when he returned to the city in the late fall, he would execute the paintings. And some of you may have gone to the Adirondack Museum in Blue Mountain Lake, and I believe they have a number of them there, and they're quite impressive. Besides the Curry and Ives prints of these over the years, which lots of us have as well. Members of the Bellows family are featured in this last one, Arguing the Point, Settling the Presidency. And 3 of them were made into Curry and Ives prints, the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th, which I mentioned. I'm sure you don't remember the order, but anyway. Tate's last entry at the Chateaugay Lake House was October 15th, 1855. Apparently, Jonathan Bellows' son, Louis, got into an argument with A.F. Tate over a board bill. Tate later packed his bags and walked the 8 miles to Chateaugay, where he caught the next train to New York, the location of his studio for the winter. Louis Bellows then sued Tate to collect the back board, which the artist owed to him. Eventually the debt was cleared up, but A.F. Tate never returned to Chateaugay Lake. Instead, the artist was to be more closely associated with Long Lake. And a lot of this information I remember getting from Warder Cadbury, who's a philosophy professor at Albany State University, and he did a book on A.F. Tate, which you can purchase, I believe, at the Adirondack Museum. The second famous guest, Chester Harding, first came to Chateaugay Lake in 1855, which was Tate's last year. Both men met each other that summer, but according to the Bellows family, Harding, the backwoods American Yankee, disliked Tate, the educated Englishman. Harding spent the next 10 summers at the lake. However, unlike Tate, he did no painting. Rather, he preferred to fly fish and just rest, staying at the lake house well into the fall each year. He brought friends with him from his home in Springfield, Massachusetts, including William Gunn, later a camp owner on the Upper Lake, which eventually became Deer Spring Lodge, owned by Cash Bellows, a direct descendant of Jonathan Bellows. Harding was the namesake for Chester Harding Bellows, a son of Louis Bellows, born in 1867. Harding died in Boston en route to Cape Cod for a fishing trip in 1866. And now we shift focus a bit with the discovery of iron ore, which vastly transformed the area, at least for 30 years or so. The discovery of iron ore at Chateaugay Lake played a large role in the emergence of the Upper Lake as a summer resort. Although the process began in 1864 when Darius Merrill, a grandson of Paul Merrill, one of the original settlers on the lower lake, moved his family and belongings to his property on the north shore of the Upper Lake, which eventually became the Merrill House property. His holdings consisted of 3 great lots, totaling 1,900 acres in all, land from the Aliout Creek to Bluff Point. Previously, the Bellows, as well as Darius Merrill, who had a few sportsmen guests at his house on the lower lake each summer, took hunting and fishing parties to the Upper Lake for the day or even overnight. Aside from a scattering of hunting shanties, no one lived on the Upper Lake until Darius Merrill moved there. On his new property, he built a small hunting lodge for family and guests. A new moneyed people came to the lake after the Civil War ended in 1865. Already they began to prefer the Upper Lake. One regular at the Bellows Chateaugay Lake house, a sports writer, way back then, Genio C. Scott, lamented the change atmosphere for the old sportsman like himself. In 1867, he wrote the following: "For loads of newcomers have come on their way to the Upper Lake, and the dining table crowded with an omnium gatherum class of odds and ends of society, intent on having a good time by bolting down their dinners and camping out in the forest to make the welkin ring so as to frighten the timid deer, by casting their anchors at the head of trout fountains, are neither capable of taking trout themselves or letting others." So this is sort of a bittersweet comment about the changes. Scott called these newcomers pleasure seekers. He continues, "It seems as if there, that one loved and sequestered spot," meaning right here, "the angler's occupation is gone, clean enveloped or neutralized by the busy pilgrims, often aimless pleasures and boisterous levity and thoughtlessness." What a pity. The sportsman writer also observed that there was a small steamer on the lake, now the Nellie Tupper, which brought visitors to the Upper Lake, especially to the newly opened Merrill House. The Chateaugay Lake House became a stopping-off place for a growing number of transients who stayed overnight on their way to the Upper Lake. Another factor besides the steamer and Merrill's Hotel on the Upper Lake, which led to a kind of eclipse of the lower lake as the main center of the resort business, was the discovery of iron ore. Already in 1860, Louis Bellows operated a small iron ore mine in the back of his hotel. Someplace back here, I know not where. Then in 1868, George Collins, an area resident, discovered a large iron ore bed to the south of Lion Mountain, 4 miles from the Upper Lake. Collins sold his claim to a group of Plattsburgh capitalists headed by Smith Weed and Andrew Williams, who formed the Chateaugay Iron Company in 1873. Pope William and Company was formed the next year and constructed a dam and ironworks at the end of the lower lake near the Bellows Hotel. More business consolidations followed, so that in 1881, the Chateaugay Ore and Iron Company was formed, and by July 29, 1903, the Board of Managers of the Delaware and Hudson Railroad took over the Chateaugay Company. The town of Belmont, not far from here, was built around the iron forge at the end of the lower lake. The forge was the world's largest at the time. It operated until 1893, when a new forge was built at Standish, near the town of Lion Mountain. As you can imagine, the iron ore business at the lower lake took away much of the charm of the area had as a virgin wilderness for sportsmen and other summer visitors. The smoke from the forge and the fires it may have caused in the woodland nearby were a regular deterrent to attracting summer visitors on the lower lake until the forge was removed to Standish in 1893. Everyone not connected with it must have breathed a sigh of relief, let alone cleaner air. Thus, the legacy of the Chateaugay Ore and Iron Company was good roads and better railroads at the end of the lower lake. A visitor to the lower lake in 1884 described the iron town of Belmont as a place where everything is dirty, covered with dust, and a person is out of fashion if his face is clean. The same visitor also noticed swaths in the forest on the west shore of the lower lake, that way, to provide where trees had been cut to provide wood for the forge fires at Belmont. Along the shores of the lake were numerous charcoal pits, 50 feet in diameter and 15 feet high. The upper lake resort business benefited most from the improved transportation routes the Chateaugay Ore and Iron Company brought to the area. In 1874, the company built a plank road from Lion Mountain to the upper lake near Darius Merrill's Hotel. The iron ore was transported from Lion Mountain and onto ore barges on the upper lake and floated 8 miles to the Belmont Forge on the lower lake. The Chateaugay Railroad, organized in 1879, transported supplies from Plattsburgh to Lion Mountain. In 1885, the railroad line was extended to Standish, past the east shore of the upper lake. The line was later continued to Saranac Lake. Being a good businessman himself, Darius Merrill rented the lakefront near his hotel to the Chateaugay Ore and Iron Company so that the company was able to build an iron ore dock at the end of the plank road from Lion Mountain. The barges, hard to believe, were 80 feet long and 17 feet wide, and had names including the Iron Age and the Maggie. John Peets and Rollo Ballard piloted these ore barges. Louis Bellows Hotel enjoyed modest summer trade during the iron ore era, so centered at the lower lake. He died in 1886. Louis's son Millard sold the Chateaugay Lake House in 1891 to J.S. Kirby and A.M. Bennett. Kirby of Brainersville soon bought out Bennett's interests and ran the renamed hotel, now the Banner House, until his own death in 1921. For good reason, perhaps, Millard Bellows sold the hotel his grandfather Jonathan had established because Millard's interest in life was really boat building. For 50 years, up until his death in 1922, he ran a boat building shop near the site of the old Bellows Hotel. Through his native talents and enterprise in the field of building and operating passenger steamboats on the lake, Millard, perhaps unknowingly, contributed greatly to the growth of the resort industry at Chateaugay Lake in an era of poor roads and stagecoaches. He enabled the spread of hotels and camps on the Narrows and Upper Lake after 1865, at a time when the steamboat was the only and smoothest means of reaching the wilderness area. And I'm sure you've heard some of the names of these boats. The Nellie Tupper, already mentioned, was owned by Captain Tupper, who ran a small establishment on the upper lake called the Adirondack House, built in 1872 on the east shore. He came from Tupper Lake about 8 years earlier. Later, that same hotel became Ralph's, and then, as many of you might remember, the Sunset Inn. The boat was built in Ogdensburg, meaning the Nellie Tupper, and could hold 20 people. George Schutz, a local Chateaugay Lake resident, apparently found a new interest in life by operating this steamboat for Captain Tupper. And Schutz is certainly a well-known name here at the lake. Like all passenger steamboats on the lake, the Nellie Tupper operated from Bellows Landing on the lower lake and made daily trips between the two lakes. And then Millard Bellows built the second passenger steamboat on the lake in the 1870s. It was called the Jenny and was owned and operated by Millard until 1881 when the boat was sold and taken to nearby Chateaugay Lake. The Jenny was 40 feet long and could hold a maximum of 25 passengers. During the summer months, it made 2 round trips each day. The fare was 75 cents round trip, 40 cents one way, and children half fare. Millard Bellows made plans for a new and larger steamboat after selling the Jenny. An 1882 advertising circular announced Bellows' plan for the new steamboat, and it read as follows: Chateaugay Lake, New York, May 18, 1882. Having sold the steamer Jenny, I am now building a steamer to take her place, which I think will be better adapted to the wants of the pleasure seekers. Apparently not a derogatory word. She is 55 feet long, 8-foot beam with 2 cabins, and will run by an 18-horsepower engine. She will make 2 regular trips connecting with the stage at the Belmont Iron Works, stopping at L. Bellows, Lake House, Merrill's, Ralph's, Indian Point, and all desired points on the lake. Excursion trips before and after regular trips. Trial trip on or about June 20th, 1882. Hoping for a continuance of your patronage, I am yours, M.S. Bellows. The new steamboat was called the Adirondack and held up to 50 passengers. It was built at a cost of $600. Bellows ran the boat until 1890, when he sold it to Ed McPherson, a local resident on the lake. The Adirondack went out of service by 1900, and it lay on the shore near the Bellows Landing for 7 years. In the summer of 1907, a band of gypsies camped near the boat and set fire to it one evening. The boat was completely destroyed. First I've ever heard that we had gypsies at Chateaugay Lake. The Emma was the last steamboat on Chateaugay Lake. Millard Bellows built it in 1901. It was smaller than the Adirondack, and later it was bought by Fred Tuttle and Paul Merrill in 1905. The new owners replaced the old steam engine with what was then coming into fashion, a gasoline engine. These 2 men continued to run the boat on Chateaugay Lake until 1917. For nearly half a century, passenger steamboats played an important part in the resort era on the lake. The steamer picked up and delivered mail, supplies, and guests, stopping at various hotels and camps around the lake. The arrival of the steamer, with its boat full of news and surprises, was a high point in the day's activities on the lake. It was said every man, woman, and child felt a personal responsibility in meeting the boat and getting the latest news. The popularity of private launches around after 1900 contributed to the decline of the passenger steamboats throughout the Adirondacks. Sensing this new trend, Millard Bellows built only private launches and guide boats after the completion of the Emma in 1901. One of the earliest writings I found on the Upper Lake is entitled 2 Days at Chateaugay Lake, published in a sportsman journal called The Spirit of the Times, and dated August 25th, 1849. The writer wrote exuberantly as follows: "Heaven, what a lovely scene!" I exclaimed, springing up and almost capsizing the boat as we glided from the Narrows into what is called Upper Chateaugay Lake. It was a few minutes after the sun set, and we glided suddenly around a projecting point, and the beautiful lake opened on our view in all its splendor. Enclosed by mountains towering upon mountains with dark green breast rising from almost the water's edge and extending in waves of unbroken green as far as the eye could reach. "What a lovely spot," I said. "Why have not people rushed to its banks to secure the choicest localities?" As we know, within 30 years, people did rush to its banks for reasons we already have seen. Visitors soon preferred to visit the Upper Chateaugay Lake to avoid the roar of furnace fires, billows of smoke, and scarred woodland 8 miles to the north on the lower lake. In the 1880s, the Upper Lake became the most popular resort of the two lakes, and remained so for years to come. Aside from Darius Merrill's small hunting lodge on the north side of the lake, there are only a scattering of hunting shanties elsewhere on the Upper Lake in 1865. Ed McPherson, who later owned the steamboat Adirondack, had a camp on Indian Point, while across the lake on Baker Point, Nat Collins ran his sporting lodge. Both men entertained parties of sportsmen at these hunting camps or shanties. Darius Merrill's dream of a resort on the Upper Lake was best described by one of his sons, Charlie Merrill, as follows: "My father's next aim was to build a larger house at the Upper Lake, and then advertise this natural playground and sportsman's paradise to the world. And to this end, he worked and planned and dreamed as he had been his dream from boyhood." By 1869, Darius was able to advertise a larger house on the site of the original hunting lodge. The ad for his hotel ran in Albany and New York papers and read as follows: "Merrill House, summer resort on Upper Chateaugay Lake, an ideal sportsman's paradise and retreat for overburdened businessmen, where they could rest in the quiet solitudes of the wilderness. Accommodations for 25 guests. Guides, $2 per day. For terms and general information, D.H. Merrill, Chateaugay Lake, New York." Like Bellows' Chateaugay Lake House, sportsmen at Merrill's began to bring their wives and children with them. The influx of women visitors to the Adirondacks necessitated the construction of more elaborate hotels with modern conveniences, such as the visitors knew in the cities from which they came. Also, many families brought with them their servants. Darius probably had all this in mind when in 1877 he made extensive improvements at his hotel, including a 3-story addition to the main structure, a blacksmith shop, a boathouse near the beach with dressing rooms for bathers, and a general store nearby on a knoll near Weed Brook. The summer of 1878 was a typical one at the Merrill House. A full house and a seemingly happy family all together, writes Darius' son Charlie. Guests included Edward Smith, governor of New York, R.K. Dana, editor of the New York World, and Bishop Morrison of the Missionary Diocese of Duluth of the Episcopal Church. A Mr. Biddle, a piano merchant from New York, and his Irish wife, both about 60, were the life of the whole house. Mrs. Biddle was the propelling force of amusement that summer and was the direct means of getting up an old-fashioned dance on the last evening before their departure for New York. And I think again and again with the hotels we hear this idea that of family being a family hotel and where everyone seemed to know each other and come back each year and visit. New services were extended to the guests. In 1878, Darius' son Charles was appointed the first postmaster at the Merrill House. A post office was opened at the hotel, and a telegraph office was also installed. After running the Merrill House for 23 years, Darius Merrill died of pneumonia on April 12, 1887, as a result of trying to save his favorite mare, which had fallen through the ice at the Aliout Creek. For the next 2 years, Darius' 3 sons, Watt, Shep, and Charles, nicknames, ran the Merrill House. Unfortunately, it has been said they were unable to get along as co-partners in the joint family enterprise. So in 1890, they dissolved the partnership and sold the hotel with 52 acres of adjoining land to Oliver Young from Clintonville, New York. Darius' advice to his sons not to sell the valuable Merrill House property went unheeded now. One day, all but a few acres of Darius Merrill's vast holdings on the upper lake, totaling 1,900 acres, from Aliout Creek to Bluff Point, would be sold. The new owner, Oliver Young, kept the name of the Merrill House, made prominent by Darius. He added to the hotel so as to attract a larger and probably wealthier clientele. Young himself was a genial host who was well liked by his guests for his tall stories, an American favorite even to this day. He had a dry sense of humor and the sharp business sense of a Yankee. One day, a woman guest apparently asked Oliver Young what the rate per day would be if she ate no breakfast. He replied, "Same price, whether you eat it all in one meal or in 3. A slouched felt hat was part of the man's usual attire. After 1890, the Merrill House was able to accommodate up to 60 guests. Indoor plumbing was installed for common bathrooms on the 2nd floor, one for the ladies and one for the gentlemen. Fireplaces were built in the new office and parlor, and new furnishings were bought throughout the hotel. Young ran a general store at the back of the hotel. The increasingly fashionable, non-sportsman clientele at Young's hotel dressed for dinner. Men were not allowed in the dining room without tie and jacket. The daily promenade, first introduced at the fashionable Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs in the 1860s, became an institution at the Merrill House after 1900. Each evening, couples walked arm in arm up and down the Merrill House porch, all along the front of the hotel, facing the lake. Guests nodded to one another as they passed by. The women were often dressed in silk gowns, some with trains, and wore jewelry. Their husbands dressed in plain suits and ties. What a far cry from the original sportsman's lodge and hotels 30 years or more earlier. Rather than hunting and fishing now, bathing, boating, tennis, and croquet became the preferred activities among the guests. Yet the Merrill House remained a family hotel where the guests knew the host and each other on a personal basis. Many of them returned year after year, a place they would call their second home. Bedroom doors were never locked at night, according to Marjorie Young Riley, Oliver's daughter, who ran the hotel until 1964, after her father's death in 1933. She said to me, when I spoke with her, of course I did know her for many, many years, as a child and upward, she once said to me that the hotel was rather like one big family. Of course, that was always her ideal. And in later years, unfortunately, the Merrill House decided they didn't want children, so they were banned. And of course, alcohol was never allowed there because that was considered to be bad form. While the Merrill House expanded and prospered during this period after the Civil War, the resort industry on the rest of the Upper Lake also flourished. In the 1880s, there were two other hotels on the lake. These were Ralph's, originally the Adirondack House on the east shore, and the Indian Point House on the west shore. Dr. Ralph bought the Adirondack House from Captain Tupper in 1878. Henceforth, the hotel was called Ralph's. With the completion of the Chateaugay Railroad in 1879, from Plattsburgh to Lion Mountain, the hotels on the Upper Lake prospered even further with the influx of more visitors to the area. These summer visitors could now travel almost all the way by railroad from the coastal cities. Accordingly, Dr. Ralph took advantage of the resort boom and enlarged his hotel to accommodate up to 125 guests. Hotel stagecoaches picked up these guests at Lion Mountain Railroad Station and conveyed them 3 miles to Ralph's. Like the Merrill House, Ralph's had a post office and a telegraph office established at the hotel. Soon Ralph's became the premier hotel on the lake. In a descriptive guide to the Adirondacks of 1895, the following appeared. It says, the New York Tribune, it has for several years been known as a resort for the best class of tourists who desire a quiet time and a good rest without the restraints of larger and more intensely fashionable hotels. The hotel is a marvel of neatness, and the table, quality, and service considered second to none in the mountains. With good boats, delightful drives, rambles in the woods, the first-class fare, the visitor's time has passed altogether too quickly, but with great benefit to the health secured by pure and bracing air. While the Merrill House and Ralph's began to attract large numbers of pleasure seekers at this time, another hotel on the Upper Lake opened in 1882, which for many years was to become the most popular sportsman hotel on the lake. The hotel belonged to Richard or Dick Schutz, a resident of the lake since boyhood when he was brought to the Adirondacks from the Hudson Valley by his father for his health to recover from consumption. Schutz regained his health and lived a long and productive life at Chateaugay Lake. Dick Schutz's hotel, called the Indian Point House, was heavily patronized by people from New York State. Uncle Dick and Aunt Edna, as Schutz and his wife were fondly called by their guests, and everyone else at the lake, were involved with their guests' daily activities. Uncle Dick took them fishing during the day, presided at the dinner table at mealtime, and told yarns around the parlor fireplace in the evening. Aunt Edna was loved for her pleasant disposition and her good cooking. The Indian Point House could accommodate 40 guests. Outside the front door of the two-story rambling structure, main building, with porches, was a sign which read, "Be kind to the birches." 2 large floating boathouses were down by the lake shore, filled with rowboats for the use of the guests. Uncle Dick, not unlike other hotel keepers in the Adirondacks during this period, had strong likes and dislikes. He kept a dead letter office underneath the front porch of his hotel, according to one regular guest, Charlotte Kineen Hackett, formerly of Hyde Park, New York. Whenever he received a letter from a person he did not want at his hotel, Uncle Dick dropped the letter between the cracks on the front porch. He often told his guests that he ran the hotel not to make money, but to learn about people and to enjoy their company. Such was the mark of a good innkeeper. It was well known around the lake that the Schutzes had little money, and that some years they had to borrow funds to open in the spring. From Forest and Stream magazine, one writer's letter dated September 24, 1885, records, Dick Schutz, who keeps the hotel at Indian Point, Upper Chateaugay, takes great pride in the amount of game he can show his visitors. The most intelligent man I have ever met in the woods. He is also the most industrious. The same writer adds, there is no prettier lake in the woods than Upper Chateaugay, and as so very few people visit it, so to the sportsman it is by so much more the more attractive. In 1901, the hotel was advertised in the Delaware and Hudson Railroad guidebook called A Summer Paradise as having accommodations for 40 adults with rates at $10 a week. Lawn tennis, croquet, and boating were available for the non-sportsman guests. Dick Schutz ran the hotel until his death in 1921. His nephew continued to operate the hotel until the place burned down in 1923, 2 years later. The last hotel built on the Upper Lake, one of the grandest and also the most short-lived, was owned by Watt Merrill, one of Darius Merrill's sons. He built it across the road facing the lake from the Merrill House. It was called Hotel Interlaken and was constructed in 1892. The hotel's colonial facade had large pillars across the front veranda, rising for the building's 3-story height, with balconies on each floor. The clientele were more sporty rather than sportsmen. Around 1898, Charles W. Backus of New Jersey, whose family had a summer camp on the east shore of the Upper Lake, bought the hotel from Watt Merrill. Backus renamed it the Chateaugay Hotel and ran it for the next few years until 1902. Due to business reverses, he sold the hotel to Alice Bentley and Eleanor Westcott, both of whom lived then in Washington, D.C. From 1902 to 1908, these two women ran the elegant hotel, now renamed Aleut Lodge. During the winter months, Alice Bentley was superintendent of music in the Washington school system, and Eleanor Westcott was principal of Western High School, also in Washington, D.C. The last entry in the Aleut Lodge register was on August 19, 1908. At 2 o'clock the next morning, the hotel caught fire and burned to the ground. Marjorie Young, daughter of Oliver Young, owner of the Merrill House, was awakened that same night by sharp stomach pains, which later developed into appendicitis. Going to her window in Young's cottage behind the Merrill House, Marjorie looked out and saw flames shooting from the roof of the Aleut Lodge across the road. Marjorie alerted her father, but by then the neighboring hotel was beyond saving. The Aleut's guests all managed to escape from the burning structure, many of them with their trunks. Alice Bentley herself saved her new $75 dress from the flames. She brought it over to Marjorie Young for safekeeping before going back into the hotel to salvage more. The Elliott's guests took refuge in the nearby Merrill House. These people and their belongings completely filled the office and parlor of Young's hotel. Many of them spent the night there, as the Merrill House already was filled to capacity. Others were taken by the Merrill House stagecoaches to the railroad station at Lion Mountain. The next day, Chateaugay Lakes' most elegant hotel was in ashes. And now I'm switching from the hotels to the camps, and I hope we're not running out of time. While the summer hotels flourished at Chateaugay Lake after 1865, numerous private camps were built on the upper lake by well-to-do business and professional men from New England and New York during the same period. These camps were within easy reach of the hotels, but inaccessible enough not to be directly involved in hotel life. The arrangement provided the owners with the privacy they sought. We need to remember that there were roads only on the north shore of the upper lake, as well as a road from Lion Mountain to Ralph's. Many of the private camps could be reached only by boat. One of the first camps on the upper lake was built in the late 1860s by George Cheney Shattuck, a physician and philanthropist from Boston. With Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry Ingersoll Bowditch, and James Jackson, he founded the Boston Society of Medical Observation. He also founded St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire in 1855. He was considered the foremost layman in the Episcopal Church of his time. According to the Dictionary of American Biography, his death was considered a public calamity. Shattuck purchased 250 acres on the west shore of the upper lake, where he erected a small cottage, and it would be all the land from Bluff Point up to the Cache Bellows place. The Shattuck family spent quiet summers in close communion with nature, taking careful note of the flora and fauna in the area. A frequent guest at Shattuck's camp was Henry Ingersoll Bowditch, a professional associate of Shattuck's in Boston, already mentioned here. In a letter dated August 10, 1869, Bowditch describes a typical day's activities at Dr. Shattuck's cottage. He wrote, "The day is lovely, with a gentle breeze, and we sit in the shade and read and write, or stroll out and pick a few raspberries, as we will." Sounds familiar. And I, in order to leave some memento of my mechanical skill, have spent about half an hour in arranging what may be called a step and support for old codgers, like myself, in getting up from the shore to the green bank on which the cottage is situated. By 1875, Henry Bowditch and his brother William built a large camp on Split Rock Point, about a mile or so beyond the Shattuck camp. Bowditch was an outstanding physician and a leading abolitionist in his day. He made his greatest medical contribution in the field of public health. He wrote Public Hygiene in America in 1878 and did a great deal of work on diseases of the chest. According to the Dictionary of American Biography, he became a distinguished student of tuberculosis, a subject which occupied his mind until his death. This last biographical note is interesting indeed, because the Adirondacks later became associated with the cure of tuberculosis through Edward Livingston Trudeau and the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium in Saranac Lake in 1884. In a letter to his wife in Boston dated September 9th, 1878, Bowditch wrote as follows: In 3 days, we shall start from this lovely place. Last night, the full moon rose superbly over the eastern hills. Carrie, Louisa, and I were off in a boat, they rowing and I paddling and steering in Kate. We rowed toward and around the island, which always stands as we intended it should stand when we selected the spot as a gem upon the waters from our eastern windows. From all that I have told you, you will imagine that although I have not given daily details, I have been busy and truly happy. How happily life seems slipping away. I have read Les Miserables, what a book it is, and what a man Hugo must be, but I have not done an iota of intellectual work. I have thought of consumption, but have always put it aside as incongruous with the scene around me. Like many summer visitors to the Adirondacks, Dr. Bowditch's only complaint about the place was the insects. His son describes his father on one occasion. My father's hatred of black flies, midges, and mosquitoes was something never to be forgotten, and his preparation against their usual onsets were often droll. I recall a picture of him at Chateaugay Lake one warm afternoon in July, clad in a long, limp linen duster which came down to his ankles, a huge, broad-brimmed, black and white speckled straw hat on the back of his head, and a shawl around his ankles. Staff in hand, he had fallen sound asleep near the old smudge kettle. He certainly wasn't the only Chateaugay Lake visitor who liked to dress up in funny clothes, as we shall see shortly. Halfway between the Shattuck and Bowditch camps, the William Gunn family built a place called Gunn's Retreat. They were from Springfield, Massachusetts, and as noted earlier, had originally summered at Bellows Lake House, beginning in 1858. Later, the property was owned by the Callender family and then Cash Bellows. The Gunn family entertained sportsmen friends from spring until fall each year, while local guides were hired on a permanent basis during the season for the convenience of the Gunn's guests. On the east shore of the upper lake, diagonally across from the Bowditch camp, Seth Thomas, son and heir of the famous Connecticut clockmaker, built a large log summer camp on Baker Point in 1878. The log boathouse built in front of the camp on the lake was unique in containing a clock tower at one end. The clock faces were on 3 sides of the tower and could be seen from around the upper lake. The Seth Thomas Clock Company in Thomaston, Connecticut began manufacturing clock towers 6 years earlier. A story told by Millard Bellows, the lake's own boat builder, reflects the strict Christian upbringing from Puritan New England of the Thomas family. Bellows was commissioned by Seth Thomas to build him a private launch. The boat was ready for delivery on a Sunday. Apparently taking little thought about the day, Millard Bellows proceeded to the upper lake to deliver his goods. Upon arriving at Baker Point, Mrs. Thomas and the children hurried down to the boathouse, whereupon Mrs. Thomas addressed Bellows in a surprised voice. "You didn't mean to deliver the boat today." Millard, realizing in a flash that the Thomases were devout Christians who never transacted business on the Sabbath, replied, "Oh no, I just came to show you the boat." With a smile and a pleasant goodbye, Bellows turned around and headed for the lower lake. The Thomases' launch was instead delivered on Monday. Also, about 1878, the Gardners, lawyers from Boston, erected a camp on Bluff Point, high above the water's edge. The original log camp burned down, and it was replaced by a large frame structure. The gardeners had purchased a piece of property 1 mile square, including acres of woodland, marshland, and the beach, which we call the sandbar. However, the gardeners rarely came to their camp. Instead, employees of their law firm in Boston stayed there. The gardener's daughter, a Mrs. Loring, inherited the property. The same pattern was repeated as with her parents. The Lorings were also Boston lawyers and frequently made the camp available to an employee, George B. Haskell. Near the Merrill House, on the Shore Road, on a knoll covered with white pines and Norway spruces, overlooking the lake, Bishop Morrison, missionary bishop of Duluth, had Frank Bellows build him a Gothic-style camp 2 stories high with a boathouse across the road on the lake. He held Episcopal church services each Sunday in the Merrill House parlor. By 1903, through offerings at these services and long socials given by Mrs. Morrison, $2,000 had been raised for building a church. The bishop then engaged 2 local carpenters, Henry and Roy Cootie of Brainersville, to build a rustic church below his own camp on the lake. The church, many of you might remember it, was called St. John's by the Lake. Here, the bishop held summer Sunday services until his retirement in 1920. The 2 last camps built in this period from 1865 to 1887 were those owned by John M. Humphrey and A.D. Boomhauer, business partners from Malone, New York. In 1884, together they built a camp on the east shore of the upper lake, close to South Inlet. But after a disagreement between them, Humphrey sold his interest in the camp to Boomhauer. He then purchased land from the Chateaugay Iron Company directly across the lake on the west shore, abutting Indian Point. Humphrey erected a 7-room cottage there in 1886 and called it Pine Lodge. I believe the camp is still owned by the heirs of the Humphrey family today. And this is the then concluding part of the lecture this morning. Modernism, you've heard that word, swept through Europe and then the United States from the late 19th century into the 20th century. It was an expression of architecture, painting, dance, music, and education, and psychotherapy. Interestingly, the next group of private camp owners at Chateaugay Lake often reflected this modernist movement, and for at least 50 years thereafter, even beyond the boundaries of this history, they flourished and prospered at Chateaugay Lake during the summer seasons, right up until 1950. Before describing this new wave of summer visitors, one local resident who helped many of them with their building needs and boating needs was Cash Bellows, a direct descendant of Jonathan Bellows. He purchased the old gun camp, by then the Calendar Camp, in 1906. Here he ran a boat repair and building business until his death in 1946. He also ran Deer Spring Lodge at the same property, taking in guests for the summer. In 1909, he built a small cottage on the east shore of the lake near the Boomhauer camp for Lance M. Parsons of Englewood, New Jersey. When I was a teenager, the Parson family was still living there at their charming camp with its lovely sandy beach out in front. Then on the west shore of the lake, Cash Bellows built 2 very impressive camps, one between his own place in Split Rock Point for the Graham Smithwick family of Memphis, Tennessee in 1919, and one earlier for the Ralph L. Hayes family of Philadelphia on Pine Point between Indian Point and Split Rock Point in 1914. Both camps had floating boathouses, which had to be towed to a nearby bay each fall and towed back again in the late spring so that the winter ice floes would not carry them off when melting each April or May. The Parsons, Smithwicks, and Hayes were more in the mold of the earlier camp owners like the Shaddocks, Bowditches, and Thomases, and not of the modernist persuasion. But in 1897, Florence Holzman, while visiting with her friend Alice Bentley at the latter's home in Chateaugay, New York, went to nearby Chateaugay Lake for the first time. Like so many of us, she fell in love with the lake. The following year, she built Camp Innermost near the sandbar on land purchased from Oliver Young of the nearby Merrill House. For many years to come, Florence Holzman, Alice Bentley, their families and friends, some from the artistic and intellectual circles of New York, Baltimore, and Washington, made their summer home at Chateaugay Lake. Some of them built elegant camps, while others opened dance and music schools at the lake for their adult students. Soon Florence Holzman built 2 smaller camps near Innermost, which she called Almost and Topmost. Here she once entertained D.W. Griffith, producer of the controversial film The Birth of a Nation, and friends like Gail Gardner, a singer from New York who later bought the old Seth Thomas camp on Baker Point. Gail Gardner and Ruth Dewing, her friend, operated a rhythmic dance school at their camp for some years until around 1924. Florence Holzman then sold part of her property to another friend, Dr. Edmund Gross of Paris, head doctor at the American Hospital in Paris. Gross built a camp on the site, designed by Miss Holzman herself and built by Merrill Smith. Known as Rest Haven, the camp was eventually sold to Florence Holzman's brother-in-law, Charles W. Hendley of Baltimore in 1922. Miss Holzman continued to run a music camp and a voice training camp at her Innermost until her death in 1961. Alice Bentley was one of the most vital and interesting characters at Chateaugay Lake during this period. After the Aliout Lodge burned in 1908, Miss Bentley continued to stay at the lake in a house behind the old hotel site. By now she lived in Greenwich Village and taught dancing at the Carnegie Hall Dance Studios during the winter. Each summer she entertained artists and dancers and writers at Camp Aliout starting in 1912. Like Gail Gardner and Ruth Dewing, Alice Bentley and Eleanor Westcott taught rhythm dancing at their lake property. Miss Bentley was one of the first American exponents of rhythmic dancing as a means of self-expression. Her students lived in tents, scattered through the woods and meadows around the main camp. Attired in layers of crinoline, these pupils danced barefooted on the outdoor dancing grounds to the strains of classical music played on a piano located nearby in the piano house. While at Chateaugay Lake, Miss Bentley wore flowing Grecian drapes and wooden sandals. In later years, she walked about with a large staff. Once described as a salty, indomitable woman, Miss Bentley never married. She was described as being tall, erect, and beautiful, who glided, not walked, across a room. She was well-read, knew good music, and could quote poetry verbatim. Her friend, the psychoanalyst and medical doctor Trigant Barreau, whom she introduced to the lake in 1916, later wrote of her, "But Alice's wide interests encompassed far more than dance. Her rare humor, her sensitivity and vitality, appealed to creative workers in various fields, and Camp Aliyah became the center of many artists and writers who visited the lake. Geraldine Farrar, Waldo Frank, Louis Untermeyer, Cissy Loftus, Marcella Sembrick, and others. This quotation comes from the book of Trigant Barreau's selected letters entitled A Search for Man's Sanity, published in 1958, 8 years after Barreau's death in 1950, and 3 years after Miss Bentley's death in 1955. During his first summer at Alice Bentley's Camp Aliyah with his wife and 2 children, Jack and Emily, Trigant Barreau bought a piece of land on the west shore of the lake, part of the old Bowditch property. Here the Barreau family and their friends and professional colleagues were to summer for many years, even to this day, even after Dr. Barreau's death in 1950. It came to be known as Camp Lithwin. Lithwin is a word Dr. Barreau found in his Anglo-Saxon dictionary. It means the joy of life. Dr. Barreau was one of the first men to introduce psychoanalysis in the United States, having once studied in Switzerland under Carl Jung. He had a practice in Baltimore, Maryland in 1916. At Camp Lithwin, Dr. Barreau continued to conduct research and treat patients each year during the summer months. Never a devotee of the psychoanalytic couch, he at first conferred with patients on a rustic bench by the lake shore. Later, a charming little study was added on a height overlooking the water. It was written of Dr. Barreau by his colleagues. In a letter from Camp Lithwin, written by Dr. Barreau to his friend, Dr. Adolph Meyer in Baltimore, dated July 16, 1918, he expresses his delight in his new summer home. It reads, "You will like, I think, much that this lake offers, and we will like nothing better than having you. I am having a good summer. There are analyses only every alternate day, except for Mr. X, who is on this side of the lake. The other day I wrote a bit, did a bit of chores about the place, and played, just play with all my heart. And I can't tell you how good it seems to have days in which not every hour is appointed. I am sure the respite allows me to bring a better quality to the analytic work." The American writer Sherwood Anderson, whose most famous book was Winesburg, Ohio, was another guest at Alice Bentley's Camp Aliyah that first summer Trigant Barreau and his family visited in 1916. The 2 men came to know one another. In the course of their walks in the woods, Anderson and Barreau held deep conversations, which the latter dramatized in his short story called Seeds. Apparently, there was much philosophical disagreement between them. In a letter to Barreau in 1921, Anderson refers to this disagreement as follows: "Tennessee," Anderson's second wife, "has come back from the Bentley camp and has told me something of you. I am afraid too often I have been in my thought of you a little sarcastic. My difficulty lay in the fact that I continually thought of you as one who believed they had found the truth. Perhaps I was angry at the thought that you could accept it. Perhaps I, in some way, wanted you to be an artist and to have an artist's point of view." Anderson and Barreau did reconcile their differences, at least through letters. What both men seemed to share in common, it seems to me, was a very complicated style of writing, which makes their ideas difficult to grasp. Perhaps they saw too much of themselves in each other. Tennessee Mitchell and Sherwood Anderson were married at Camp Aliyah that same summer of 1916 by a justice of the peace. Their marriage was to be with the understanding that they would be free to come and go as they pleased. They hoped wistfully for the kind of bohemian marriage that their friends talked about at the time, a union unencumbered by the customary pledges of constant fidelity and obedience. Very modern indeed. Another friend of Alice Bentley's, who came to the lake in the early 1900s, was Franklin Haven Sargent, founder of the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, and a member of the famous Sargent family of Boston, including the portrait painter John Singer Sargent. Franklin Sargent and his mother first came to the lake as guests of the Bowdages of Split Rock Point, another famous Boston family, as we have seen. Around 1910, Sargent built a camp across from the Merrill House property on a high knoll along Route 374. Later, a stone amphitheater was added alongside the camp in the woods. Sadly, he took his own life in Plattsburgh en route to New York at the Witherell Hotel on August 28, 1923. A friend of Sargent's wrote about his death as follows. For years, Mr. Sargent had been lonely and sad, but this morose quality only set off his unusual personal charm and endeared him to his friends. Then the same friend noted, what a pity he was alone on his vacation. His camp at Chateaugay Lake and 25 shares of AT&T stock valued at $3,000 he left to his faithful colored housekeeper, Sadie Walker. A star of the Metropolitan Opera in New York, Geraldine Farrar, summered at her parents' camp near the Dan Griffin's property on the Narrows. As a girl, she used to practice on the piano in the Merrill House parlor. In later years, Geraldine spent less time at the lake, but the sight of her father's sleek white launch, the Geraldine, was a reminder of the opera star's ties with the lake. Eventually, the Geraldine was sold to Trigant Barreau, who used it regularly for Camp Liftwood. And finally, the celebrated Evelyn Florence Nesbit Thaw made her first appearance at Chateaugay Lake in 1915. Evelyn Nesbit, her 5-year-old son Russell Thaw, and her 2 maids registered at the Merrill House on June 23rd. A few days later, Evelyn, her son, and maids left for the Culane camp on the Narrows, West Shore, where Evelyn's dancing partner, Jack Clifford, born Virgil Montani, was awaiting them. Meanwhile, in New York, Evelyn's husband, millionaire Harry Thaw, was appealing to the courts for a release from the Matawan State Hospital. Thaw had been committed to this insane asylum 8 years earlier for the murder of the prominent New York architect and socialite Stanford White on June 25, 1906. During the summer of 1915, Evelyn Nesbit's name appeared on the front page of newspapers across the country. The publicity-shy Mrs. Thaw tried, but without success, to find refuge at Chateaugay Lake from the press, the state attorney general, and the grim realities of her past life. Harry K. Thaw was released from the Matawan Asylum on July 16th of that year. By now, reporters had discovered the whereabouts of the retiring Mrs. Thaw. They flocked to Chateaugay Lake to obtain a statement from the freedman's wife. Mrs. Thaw refused to see reporters, but she did release a statement from her camp that she believed the verdict on her husband's sanity a mistake. These were the days before helicopters, television cameras, radio, and few telephones. Evelyn Nesbit married Jack Clifford the following year on May 26, 1916. 2 weeks later, the newlyweds, with a party of 7 friends, arrived at Chateaugay Lake and stayed at the Culane camp. Mr. and Mrs. Jack Clifford announced plans for building a $35,000 camp on the former Shattuck property on the Upper Lake, promising it to be the finest camp in this part of the Adirondacks. The camp was completed in 1917 and lavishly furnished. Meanwhile, Evelyn Nesbit made several motion pictures that summer at Chateaugay Lake. Her Mistake starred Evelyn Nesbit and her son Russell in a dramatization of the Fall murder case. In one scene, Evelyn was shown jumping off Moffat's Island in the center of the upper lake. Shortly after completion of these movies, Evelyn and Jack got a separation. It was rumored that Evelyn ran off with her leading man in these movies. She tried to get back with Jack Clifford the next summer, 1918. She returned to the lake and rowed over to Clifford's camp from the Merrill house. Jack met Evelyn at the door, but refused to let her in or to go back with her. In the divorce proceedings a few years later, Evelyn asserted that Mr. Clifford had lived on $100,000 of her money from 1916 to 1918. The money to build the Clifford camp then probably came from Evelyn. She died at age 82 in a convalescent home in Santa Monica, California on January 18, 1967, survived by her son, Russell Fall. Jack Clifford continued to summer at Chateaugay Lake for many years, where he was known as everybody's friend. He was well liked by many people around the lake for his bear stories and his kind ways with children. And this, as you can see, is the old Merrill House sign, which used to be on 374, nicely crafted out of twigs and so forth. And this is the Merrill House, which you've seen many pictures of. And the old car or van there sort of dates to be the early 50s. This is the cottage where Marjorie Young looked out the window and saw the Camp Alliad burning across the street. And for many years, Marjorie entertained all of her special guests at the cottage. It was a special treat to stay at the cottage and not at the hotel. And that is the Merrill House porch, a part of it looking out onto the upper lake and over to Bluff Point through the trees. And that's the old boathouse beside the lake and going down to Merrill Beach. And the croquet lawn is right there out in front, where the famous croquet matches took place, sometimes into the night with people carrying lanterns. And here is a scene. I know two of the people in the photograph. Marjorie Riley is the second woman on the left, the smallest woman. And the man on the farthest right is Ed Bradburn, who was a bachelor and came to the Merrill House for years and always stayed at the cottage with Margie. The other two people, I'm not sure, but they were regular guests at the Merrill House, and maybe some of you know who they are. Anyway, there was a game of croquet about to begin. And this is the landing spot at the Merrill House, boats coming in. And I don't know if Linda is here. She is. I think that's Linda when she was a teenager, carrying the oars up from the boat dock.
Moffat's Island in the rear.
Moffat's Island in the rear. The Sleeping Giant over on the or Ragged Lake Mountain. And this is Merrill Beach on a July summer afternoon in the 1950s, just like today. And a lot of members of my own family. I think that's my mother with the white hat standing, and my grandparents lying down, and another grandmother, and my father, and some other people. And this is the Jack Clifford Evelyn Nesbitt camp. And when this photograph was taken, the camp was probably 40 years old by then. And this is the Cache Bellows Deer Spring, which no longer stands either. Taken on a beautiful summer day with the reflection, so wonderfully portrayed here. And this is the Ralph L. Hayes camp on Pine Point, later owned by the Hacketts and then by my family. And today it's owned by Steve Jervis. Yeah, and that's it.
That was Reverend Henry C. Rushmeier. It was a lecture on the development of the hotels and early history of the lakes, the Chateaugay Lakes, that is, and is the author of Chateaugay Lake, a case study in Adirondack Resorts, 1840 to 1917. Outside of the living room area, where we just, our parlor, where we just had that presentation, is a display of photos, including shots of the alley out, not the current alley out, but the alley out that existed from, I believe, 1902 to 1908. And this is what it looked like after the fire. Here's the Chateaugay house. And here's what the alley out looked like from the lake. There are a lot of interesting photos, including this one of a stagecoach from Lion Mountain. There's a shot of Gunn's retreat. The Gunn family mentioned prominently in Reverend Rushmeier's presentation. There's some hunters at Gunn's retreat. And as you can see, this was not the elegant crowd. This is the guys who came to hunt. So this is what happened at the Manor House. We're going to move on to another location at the present time. As I was trying to get out the door, this young lady stopped me here, and Addie Shields, county historian for the Clinton County, said I have to take a shot of this painting on the wall over the mantle. Why is that, Addie?
Because it shows the Narrows. It is this area, but it reflects the Hudson River artists. All of them at that time were schooled with, and this is the touch. Notice it. Notice the colors. It's period. And notice the frame. The whole business is probably worth what? In excess of, please, but it's this area. There is the Narrows, but here is someone who was schooled in this Hudson River artist schooling, which was prevalent at that time. And see, it is 1901. And here was the Banner House, and see how small it was and so forth. Notice how close they were to nature, too. You know, we all have so much that is so far from. Okay?
Okay, that's why we're taking a photo of this artist rendering from 1901 that sits here in the Banner House. We are now on the Bigelow Road, which is just off the Schutz Road, which is just off Route 374. And we are at a location known as the Lakeview School, and the old schoolhouse here in Merrill. And judging from the number of cars that are parked along the route, I've got my doubts as to whether I'll have much of a free rein in looking at the photos inside, but we're going to take a look inside and see what we can get, but chances are we'll be kind of crowded in there and not able to do what we'd like to do with those photos. Here's an interesting aerial view. And it shows the upper lake. And this must be the Narrows. Very interesting aerial photo. We assume this is the bottom of the lower lake because it says, "Are you, or were you, one of the frequenters of the Belmont bathing beach?" But as expected, there's just too many people in here for our purposes. These displays are highly popular, as they should be, and if you don't take advantage of this annual event, and you are missing out on something. Then of course the long-range plan is to have a museum in the old train station up in Lion Mountain. And when that happens, then I'm sure many of these photos and artifacts will be on display. And here's a map of the lower and upper Chateaugay Lakes. Before we depart this spot, we're going to just take a shot of the outside view of the old schoolhouse, and we will be getting together with members of the group and doing a story on this year's exhibit. So if we haven't done that already, look for it in the not too distant future. We will be going probably sometime in September. We will be doing a follow-up story with as many of these photos that they've got exhibited around the various locations, and doing a follow-up story on this year's Chateaugay Lake Arts program. Almost directly across the road from the Hollywood is the Boatworks, and at this location, at the Lakeside Boatworks, Hallie C. Bond, curator of the Adirondack Museum and author of Boats and Boating in the Adirondacks, gave a talk and slide presentation. And also at this site there was an actual boat building display. I believe it was Richard McIntyre who did the demonstration. Unfortunately, our time does not allow us to spend the time at each of these places that we would like. This is a Saturday, and we've got another thing to tape tonight and a couple things on Sunday. And there's only so much hours in a week that we can devote to Hometown Cable. And if you'd like to see us devote more time to your favorite subject, why not support Hometown Cable? Because so few of you are supporting our efforts. It'd be nice to get a little extra support, and maybe we could cover the events that are of interest to you in greater detail. In the meantime, thanks for watching Hometown Cable. And we've been at the 4th annual Chateaugay Lakes Arts Association historic display, and this is going to wrap up the 2002 coverage.